Good morning. Good morning, everyone, for an on-time start. I'm Deborah Stipek, and it is my privilege and honor to introduce our next keynote speaker, Dr. Allan Wigfield. Allan Wigfield is professor in the Department of Human Development and Quantitative Methodology at the University of Maryland. He is also a distinguished scholar teacher and university honors fellow. I'm not sure exactly what those mean because every university has its own way of honoring and recognizing their most distinguished faculty, but I'm glad to know that Allan is honored and appreciated at home as he is abroad. He was appointed in 2015 as an honorary professor of psychology at the University of Heidelberg. His research... Is there a musical interlude here? Should I stop for a moment? His research focuses on how children's motivation develops across the school years in different areas, and also on developing interventions to improve children's motivation. In his intervention work, he's focused primarily on children's reading motivation and competition. Dr. Wigfield has authored more than 130 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters on children's motivation and other topics. He's edited 4 books and 6 special issues of journals on the development of motivation and the development of reading comprehension and motivation. And in his spare time, he attends international conferences. I do think that I need to put an end to a rumor that Allan Wigfield can jump over tall buildings. It's not true. He can only jump over short buildings. I also want to say that I have heard Allan sing in a karaoke bar in Seoul, South Korea. And I want you to know that we should all be very grateful that he was invited to speak and not to sing. Somebody was described the other day as being famous but approachable. So Dr. Wigfield is infamous for his singing, famous for his scholarship and leadership in the area of educational psychology, and he is very approachable. So welcome to Dr. Wigfield.
Thank you very much, Deborah. It was a wonderful introduction, and I sort of remember that night in the singing club. But yeah, got to be a little bit long. Well, and also thank you very much for the organizers of the symposium to invite me here. This is not the symposium, the conference, my second ICM trip, and I'm already becoming really attached to the conference. And it's particularly nice to be in Greece because I'm a real history buff, a history fan, and do read a lot about American history and think about our long history dating all the way back to 1775. And so when I'm looking at ruins from 3 BC, it puts in perspective our self-importance in the US about what an important country we are. And it's just always an amazing thing to do that. As Deborah said, I've had the fortune over the last several years, let's see if this is working here. Over the last several years of traveling internationally and visiting people at different universities and learning about the universities. And often I get asked here, now where exactly is Maryland? Where is the University of Maryland? So I thought I'd just take a little bit of time for those of you that don't know to talk a bit about that. So there's a map of our interesting looking state of Maryland. This border was not drawn by a 2-year-old. That's actually the Potomac River running down, and this is the Atlantic Ocean here. So if you go fly for a very long time, eventually you'll get to Thessaloniki, way over there. Now, there's another important part of where Maryland is, and that is the fact that it's quite close to Washington, D.C., and in fact, Washington, D.C. fits right in that little diamond there. And many of you probably know that we have a, let's choose an adjective here, interesting, important, bizarre presidential election going on this year in our country. And I purposely chose the color blue to represent the state of Maryland because some of you may not know that in the US, the presidential election is not decided just by the popular vote, but by how each state votes for the particular presidential candidate. candidate. And over the last 20-ish years, commentators have talked about blue states, which tend to vote for the Democratic candidates, in this case Hillary Clinton, or the red states, which tend to vote through Republican candidates, in this case Donald Trump. And so I've always been quite happy to live in a blue state, and that's particularly true this year given what's going on with our political situation. So there's a picture of our pretty green campus. I don't know how you can see that, but we'll do apologies to my friends from Michigan. You can tell it's Maryland because of the M. And our campus is 10 kilometers from the Washington Capitol, which is pretty nice. So whenever there's a motivational emergency somewhere in the country, my team and I can get down there pretty quickly to help out and try to develop some solutions. Now, another thing I learned traveling internationally is that US institutions are somewhat unique because we have mascots for our universities. And I found that many countries around the world don't have that, and I think it's maybe a little bit strange. In the US, it's primarily to identify our sports teams. In the case of Maryland, our mascot is a turtle because there's lots of water around the state, terrapin turtle, in fact, and so we're called the Terrapins. And the name of our turtle is Testudo. And I Googled that to see if it was a Greek name, but unfortunately it comes from the Latin, so I can't claim that. But when you meet somebody from Maryland, what you say is, if I can get to the next slide. Oops. Try to go back, one more back. Say, go Terps. Now, there's several of us from Maryland today. Raise your hand, Maryland people, right there. So when you greet them later today, say, go Terps, and you'll immediately have a bond with them. So, okay. Okay, so the roadmap for this talk is I'm going to divide it basically into 3 parts. So I'll give a brief background and historical overview of expectancy value, very brief on that. I'll spend a fair amount of time talking about the developmental work on children's expectancies and values, and Ruth's talk and Deborah's talk really sets up some of the points I want to make nicely, and so you've learned some of the things already, so I can go over some of that briefly. A particular thing I want to focus on now is the exciting new work on cost, which is really coming into its own after many years of neglect in expectancy value models. And then the final part of the talk will be on some of the new interventions, particularly focused on expectancies and values. All right, why am I having trouble with this clicker here? Maybe this guy will work. Nope. There we go. Okay, just quickly. So to do the history really briefly, since I'm running a little behind here. So expectancy value theory originally was formulated specifically by John Atkinson at the University of Michigan in 2 papers developing a mathematical model of achievement motivation that had a prominent role for expectancies and values. And Jackie Eccles and colleagues built on this in pretty substantial and fundamental ways in their 1983 chapter defining expectancies and values in different sorts of ways than Atkinson's initial definition. And I'd also like to note that the expectancy value theory that Jackie and I have been working on bears some similarities to Reinhardt's control value theory, and at some point we should talk more about that. But I'll be focusing primarily on our model today. So a really critical thing to start off with is that Jackie's model was originally developed to think about the reasons why girls were not going into science and math careers back in the 1980s. And so there's always been a focus not just on performance, but also on choice. And in her writings, Jackie often calls the model a model of achievement choice. And so I think that's a really critical thing to remember as we think about the variables we're discussing today. And as I said, back at that time, there was a focus on girls and why they're not going into STEM. And that actually still is a part of the focus of the model, and we'll come back to that a little bit later. Maybe if I put my glasses down, I'd do better with this. So it's hard for me to go on without recognizing Jackie and her fundamental contributions here. Some of you, particularly my German colleagues, might recognize where that picture was taken. That's at the Heidelberg Castle from a wonderful day in Heidelberg we had in 2014. And Jackie gives her greetings to everybody. She's sorry she's not here, but she had just traveled to Finland and was unable to come this time. So there is the very large model of expectancies and values, and fortunately for you, I'm not going to go through all of those boxes today. Particularly fortunate since I'm sure in the back you can't see them, but I'm going to be focusing primarily on this part because that's where most of my work has been centered with Jackie on that, just in these expectancies of success, achievement values, and their relations to performance and choice. And it's always a little bit humbling to look at 3 boxes like that and think about, man, I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm talking about 3 boxes, but that's sort of the way it is. So let me just start with some definitions. I think that's really important for our field, and there's a whole lot of different definitions, particularly for competence-related beliefs. The way that we've talked about them is up there. So expectancy for success are a sense of how well we are going to do on the task in the future, not right now, but next year. So questions like, how well will you do in your math class next year? Self-concept of ability, as we define it, is our evaluations of our current competencies. How good are you at math? And we often ask that in comparison to other people as well as to other subjects. And if people are interested in our questionnaires, there's a website where you can find them. I'll show you later. The part of our, let me just say one more thing about that. Now, we distinguish those theoretically, but it's very difficult to distinguish those empirically. So our factor analyses always group those two together. They just really don't separate. They're very highly correlated. Achievement task values, and I'm going to focus on the word task because we've really focused primarily at that level, domain and task levels of things. It's not broader values for education, but valuing math or valuing particular tasks in math. And we've talked about interest, importance, and utility. I think many of you are probably familiar with those definitions, and they've been talked about, as well as cost. And I'll come back to ways of conceptualizing those a little bit later. So let me start with some of the work that we've done on changes in children's expectancies and values over the school years. This is sort of the first set of data findings here. And as both Deborah and Ruth talked about, the changes in motivation that occurred during the school years tend to be overall one of decline. Young kids, as Deborah illustrated really nicely yesterday, often come to school really excited about learning. They're raring to go. They even want their homework. They often have a pretty high sense of competence and interest in a lot of different things, and they really seem to enjoy learning. Over the course of the school years, so for many children and not all, and that's why I have the term normative up there, that's a really important point that we'll continue to think about here, there's often a decline of those sense of competence beliefs. Maybe sometimes a decline to get more realistic, but it's sometimes a decline to get more pessimistic. And values and intrinsic motivation decrease as well. And a variety of papers that are looking at that. We've reviewed that all in a chapter in the Handbook of Child Psych. If you'd like that, I can send that to you. So I'll just show you some of the data from our projects that have looked at that. We've been engaged in a long-term longitudinal study called the Childhood and Beyond Study, and the website there just has a host of information about all of our measures and papers and so on and so forth. And in the study, we followed kids all the way through elementary, middle, and high school. So we started with a group of kids when they were 5, 6, and 8. Followed them till they graduated from high school, continued to follow them, and are even following some of them to this day. And so Jackie and I are really fortunate that we started the project when she was 25 and I was 20, so we're still around to talk about it. And it's not going to happen for too much longer. So the gray boxes here indicate a gap in the collection of data. We lost our funding for a few years, so that's why that's there. It wasn't planned, but that's what happens, so it happens sometimes. But it's one of the few studies that have traced the development of different kinds of motivation-related beliefs and values all across the school years. And I'll also just say it's a sample of about 1,000 kids, so relatively large, but mostly white middle-class kids. And so keep that in mind as you're thinking about the results. So we published a variety of papers on the change over time. I think it's best represented, the normative change is best represented in a paper by Jan Jacobs and several of us in 2002, Child Development. And this is what happens to kids' math competence beliefs over the course of the school years. You can see that they start out pretty high, and over time they gradually go down. And because this is growth curve modeling, it's very sort of straight looking. That's really not the case if you look at the individual means and different kinds of analyses, because this kind of smooths things out. The other critical thing, going back to the gender issue that I mentioned earlier, if you'll notice, boys and girls differed in their competence beliefs at the beginning of the school years, with boys thinking they were better than math, and girls thinking this isn't a comparative question, but just how good are you at math? Boys are saying more so than girls are. But in this study, by the end of the school years, and actually this is a good thing, that difference had narrowed to basically nothing. And this is actually kind of a pretty different finding than what people used to report about self-concept of ability in the literature. So some cultural shifts in how boys and girls are seeing themselves in mathematics. So that's kind of one pattern of decline there. A similar thing for language arts competence, reading competence, but here the gender differences are a little different. Boys and girls start off at the same point, but by the end of the school years, girls are feeling more positive about their language beliefs, boys less so. That's an interesting, different phenomenon in itself. But so the gender differences really vary by domain, and that's another important thing to think about as you think about this, this model. So I'm not going to, oops, too far. I'm not going to talk a lot about the next slide, if I can get back to it. Sorry for being such a klutz here. Sorry. Where are you seeing there? I'm doing.
These here.
Oh, thanks. So one of the really neat things is that's why I need my glasses. So you can see that I get my finger on it. There it is. Okay, so one of the really interesting things we've looked at in this study is how the changes in competence, beliefs, and values related to each other. And what we found there was that the change in values was explained to a great degree by how children's competence beliefs change. So there's an interesting lots of debate in the field about do we develop interest and then competence, competence then an interest, or how do they sort of interface? Clearly that'll get reciprocal, but in our data we're finding that changes in the competence beliefs are what we're changing students' valuing of achievement. So clearly they're relating together. Okay, so another thing that we looked at, because we have longitudinal data, and I think this next slide is really important as we think about those changes, is there are the mean level declines, but there's also changes in stabilities of kids' beliefs. And this slide is very full of numbers. You don't need to look at all of them. This is from a different study, 6th and 7th grade kids measured at 4 different times, and looking at how stable their means are over the years. So for just taking math, self-concept, you can see that by the last 2 waves in 6th and 7th grade, they're in the 50s. Sports competence beliefs get all the way up to into the 70s. So kids' sense of their capabilities starts to get pretty stable as they're moving through school. So if you go back to the other charts, what that means is that the declines mean the kids are staying in relatively the same position because there's stability in their beliefs. So if you believe that your math ability is at a certain level in 6th grade, you're going to be at that relatively same level the next year, even though within the pattern of the group. And that's an important consideration for intervention that we'll come back to. As beliefs and values get more stable, they're probably going to be a little more difficult to change over time, but we can come back to that a bit later. So why the declines in expectancies and values? And Deborah and Ruth had some really good things to say about this, so I will make my remarks kind of quickly. The sort of story over the years that Ruth challenged a little bit the other day, and I think in important ways, are the kids get better at understanding the information they're getting, the information gets clearer, they react more strongly to failure. Jackie had a very interesting study with Diane Rubel back in the 70s about giving kids failure experiences, asking how they think they would do next time. Young kids continue to think they do just fine, even after several failure experiences. Older kids, even 3rd and 4th grade, really started to dampen down their expectancies as a result of their failures. And so there's that sort of thing, the optimism to more realism. Even though, as Ruth pointed out correctly, younger kids engage in social comparison, this becomes more frequent and probably more accurate as kids are moving through school. But there's also many important changes in schooling that have a strong effect on this, as Deborah really illustrated clearly in her talk, particularly around elementary school kids. More frequent evaluations in the US and many other places, high stakes evaluations, so kids get more feedback about how they're doing. Teachers are stressed and nervous, you've got to do well on this, and so there's just kind of a sense of school becoming work. Ability grouping and tracking can have strong effects. And what we found, and what Jackie Eccles and Carol Midgley wrote really a lot about, is these changes in the US at least are particularly difficult at middle school, because middle school kids are very motivated, but often not for school, for many other kinds of things. And so it's kind of a combination of psychological and school effects that seem to explain the declines overall. And so that's kind of what we've been talking about. But some of the more recent work that we've done with this, using the CAB data sets and some other data sets as well, show that the pattern of normative change is probably too simplistic, as probably most of you would agree. Normative change can't describe everybody by any stretch of the imagination. And so we've begun to look, using some of the interesting new sorts of analyses out there to look at longitudinal data, how different patterns of change emerge over time. And this is just one study from, again, from the CAB data set by Archambault et al. In Journal of Ed Psych in 2010. And you can see, this is looking at kids' reading ability beliefs, but you can just see all of the different ways in which kids' ability beliefs separated into the groups declines. Some decline more than others, some decline and are coming back up. I won't talk about this here, but Archambault et al. Talk a lot about some moderators of these effects, gender and achievement and others. One of the unfortunate things about CAB was we don't have a lot of information about what's going on in the schools, and so it's difficult to know exactly what kind of schooling experiences the kids are having. But you can imagine for some of the kids in different classrooms, maybe their positive or negative interactions with teachers are explaining this. So yes, decline, but cautious, you have to be a bit cautious about that because those patterns are potentially different. And again, that possibly could have some implications for intervention, and we can come back, think about that as we talk about some of the intervention work later on. Last year, Lauren Musu-Gillette and I and Jackie and a stat professor named Ed Herring published another paper on this. This time we took the subset of the kids who actually went into college, so looking at how the change continued to go over college. And you can see, once again, different trajectories of decline there in both ability beliefs in math as well as their interest in math. And to me, this sort of high interest in math is a really critical sort of thing. So as we think about change, the sort of long-standing way that we talked about it, decline, there, but we have to talk about it in more nuanced ways now. And I think as we continue to study other groups, we'll find that even more. And clearly some of these changes also develop across culture. Eva Pomerantz has some interesting data from China showing that Chinese kids' values do not go down in middle school. They're actually going up for mathematics in middle school, in contrast to what we find in the States. So some interesting differences to think about there. So why do we care about the decline in values and expectancies? What does it matter? Maybe it's an interesting phenomenon in its own if you're a developmental psychologist, but maybe it's not enough just to think about that. So another critical part of the model that we've looked at is how the ability beliefs and the values predict out to performance and choice in different areas. And I'll just give you a couple of illustrations on that. This is from a study that seems just like yesterday to me, but for many of you probably think, oh man, that's really old. Why is he talking about that work? Trust me, it'll happen to you later on. But so this was from not the CAB data set, but from an earlier data set of the kids in 5th to 12th grade. And the crucial thing to say there, because I know from sitting in the back myself, those numbers are probably not real easy to read, but just look at the links here. So kids grades year 1 predict their grades year 2, not a very surprising finding there. They also relate positively to the perceptions of ability. This kind of goes back to the discussion yesterday about how meaningful are the relations between motivational beliefs and achievement, pretty strong in this study. And perceived ability measured year 1 predicts out to expectancies year 2, which predicts kids' grades, and quite strongly in that second year. So clearly the performance and beliefs are working together, but that linkage really shows that longitudinally. On the other hand, values are predicted by perceivability, do not relate directly to grades, but do directly relate to kids' intentions to continue taking more mathematics. And so what we've often said in the literature is that ability beliefs predict performance, values predict choice. That's mostly correct, but you also have to look at this link here. Given the fact that expectancies and values themselves relate together, there's actually indirect effects of values on grades as there are expectancies on choice. So it's a little bit more complex than just expectancy, performance, values, choice. And we've been trying to write it that way more recently, but you can kind of see those linkages here. In the more recent study, the Musu-Gillette et al. Study that I just mentioned a minute ago, really interesting findings in this study looking at how the trajectories of change in students' beliefs and values impact their choice of math major in college. And the two really critical findings from this study are, one, values really was the stronger predictor of the math major than was their ability beliefs. And then depending upon whether they were in the high, the slow decline, or the fast decline group, you can see the differences there with respect to how much math was chosen in the major. We coded math major based on a coding system that's in the literature. So the kids that stayed pretty high in interest are much more likely to be in math-related careers. Those whose interests decline fast, they're bailing out. So they're not doing anything with math. And so it's interesting to trace out all the way back to 4th grade. The changes in interest starting in 4th grade relate out to the choices that the kids make. So I think at this point we can say that not only the beliefs and values are changing, but they're also predicting really important outcomes in kids' lives. And Jackie and others have also looked at these in relation to a whole variety of activity choice issues. I won't talk about that work today, but it's, again, the choice part being really pretty fascinating there. So the part of the model that I haven't talked very much yet, the cost part, the neglected part of the model, suddenly is changing because all of a sudden there's a lot of interesting work on cost. Stuart was describing some of that work yesterday, so I'm going to turn to that next to wind up this section. So here's finally a graph that potentially you can see a little bit better, kind of the last parts of the model there. We're going to focus particularly on this box here. So you can see the way that we have sort of put things are in terms of value is that the four parts of value are, the four parts of value sort of comprise value overall. So all of them are kind of inside that, that box, and that's a little bit of a, maybe of a problem with boxes in terms of how you think about that. There's a really great symposium on costs at ARA last year. I'm just summarizing a few of the points from that. Some of you might have gone to that. But I just wanted to trace quickly the ways in which we've defined cost over the years. So Jackie started by talking about cost as an influence on value, not so much a part of value, but an influence on that, as you can see in the quote there. And she described it in those kinds of ways. Because costs can lead to avoidance. So if something costs too much, then you're not going to do it. One of Jackie's best anecdotes about that, her daughter at about age 10 was not really enjoying school very much, so she wasn't doing her homework. And Jackie said, "Amy, why aren't you doing your homework?" And she looked at me and said, looked at her and said, "Why do you want me to waste my childhood doing homework?" So the cost of doing homework was wasting her childhood. Amy's a little dramatic, but I think that illustrates it pretty well. So then in '92, Jackie and I published a paper in which we talked about four components of costs, kind of reflecting the box there, and made the point that cost is at least studied. Without patting myself on the back too much, this paper is cited a lot in the literature, and so I think people adopted the view that the four components are what comprise value, a little bit different than how Jackie talked about it initially. Jackie has a wonderful chapter on value in 2005 in Andy Elliott's first handbook, which again, she talks about cost influencing value, but value also has four components. So we've been just a little bit back and forth. Maybe I should take some responsibility for that. Sorry about that. Back to the talk yesterday about infatuation with constructs. We need to be clear about our constructs, maybe not just infatuated with them. And we're trying to do that now. So in a chapter we have coming out in Andy Elliott's next handbook of competence and motivation, my student Emily Rosenzweig, Jackie, and I are talking about cost. All of these different kind of costs combining up to influence overall cost and then to influence task value. And so the people are beginning to study that. The colleagues at Tübingen and Hannah Gaspard is here, as well as Isabel Hafner, are doing studies of German students' costs and values in different areas. And Hannah and her colleagues developed a new, really interesting measure of costs that I think shows a lot of promise for use in the literature. And a couple of findings from their project that are particularly relevant to this issue is they're finding that the value components and cost factor separately, quite interesting gender and age differences. And one of the most interesting ones to me is that in Germany, at least, the only place favoring boys with return to values is physics. The other areas that the German female students have more positive values and perceive less cost. So the hard sciences, physics is the only place where the gender difference favors boys these days. Again, showing how these things can change over time. In 2015, Ken Barron and Chris Hulleman wrote a really interesting chapter sort of looking historically at cost and what it means. And they made the proposal that the theory should be renamed to the expectancy value cost theory in order to make the role of costs clearer and to make it really understood that cost is not just a subcomponent value, but something that influences it on its own and maybe should be looked at separately. And that, we talked about that at the symposium. So cost should be added to the can I do this and do I want to do it? How much is this going to cost me is a critical way to look at things. And so Jackie and I, of course, have been discussing this at different times, and we're quite interested in the antecedents of cost, how people take all of the information they're getting about their different activities and deciding how much it costs them to do an activity versus how much they are interested in it versus how capable they are. And Jackie's been looking at some really interesting complex work in the decision-making literature about how we work together with information. So those of you that want to do more sort of focused micro studies of the processes involved in our judgments about our abilities, values, and costs could do some really interesting work here as we try to understand the nature of these things and their relations. And people are also beginning to look at this using pattern-centered approaches. There's a number of studies here, but Anne-Marie Conley has a particularly interesting study from 2012 showing that students' perceptions of cost are what really separate positive senses of ability, value, and actually achievement goals from more negative ones. It's really where they lie on the cost dimension that works out there. we'll talk a little bit in a few minutes about some new interventions looking at cost as well. So more broadly, do we think that the theory's name should be changed? Not quite yet. So that's an empirical question at this point, and maybe at some point we'll come along with this, but at this point we don't think there's enough evidence to change the name, but we're really happy to see that the work on cost is accelerated in these sorts of ways. Okay, so let's go to part two. So talk for a little bit about interventions focused on enhancing students' valuing of achievement in particular. Won't focus very much on the expectancy part here. And I'll just start by a quick slide showing, as we think about interventions, there's different ways that we can do them and different ways people have done them in the literature. So some people have done interventions with individual kids. Think about Carol Dweck's work, trying to change kids' attributions to make them less learned helpless. So don't think of yourself as lacking ability, but lacking effort or lacking strategies. Dale Shunk and Bandura and others have done a lot of work with individual kids to try to get them to feel more efficacious about what they're doing. We can also intervene at the classroom level, where teachers or people can come in and try to do things to enhance motivation at those broader kinds of levels. Or one step further, at overall schools or even school districts levels. And one of the classic examples in the motivation literature is Maren Midgley's studies in middle schools trying to change the goal structures to focus less on performance and more on mastery goals over time. You can see the two sites there have a lot of good work on that. Tim and Stewart's recent volume of the Advances in Motivation series has a really nice series of chapters on different interventions, so I highly recommend that to you if you haven't seen that yet. Now, I've done a lot of work at the classroom level with my colleague John Guthrie in the area of reading. I'm not going to talk about that work today, but I just wanted to, of course, give Corey a plug because we think it's wonderful. I'll show you the website if you're interested in this. But more importantly, I'm just going to use this as a contrast for some of the simpler intervention work I'll get to in a minute here. So in Corey, what we do over a period of several weeks, ranging from 6 to 12, is try to help students develop their motivation by having teachers work with them in very specific ways to do all of these things that come out of a whole variety of motivation theories that won't elaborate here. And we also at the same time are teaching them strategies. So kind of as Deborah was saying yesterday about her intervention, Corey is everything in the kitchen sink approach to motivation. We don't really know maybe specifically what will work, so let's try a whole lot of stuff and see if we can connect to different kids in different sorts of ways. And Corey has had success. If you're interested in that, you can email me and I can tell you more about that. But what's been happening recently, as many of you I'm sure are familiar, is people have been developing simpler social psychologically based interventions that are relatively brief and relatively quick. And David Yeager and Greg Walton in 2011 had an article in RER, one of my favorite titles of many years, about how these social psychological interventions aren't magic, because some people think, how can such a brief intervention have strong effects? And they sort of enumerate some interesting examples there about how that would work. Of course, Carol Dweck in her work on mindsets is beginning to develop a mindset intervention that also is pretty quick and pretty easy. You maybe can't read that, but Carol's books on mindset have over 1 million copies in print. We should all be so lucky, right? So she's doing pretty well with this. It's getting a lot of attention, not just in the research literature, the education circle, but in popular presses as well. So I just wanted to give you 3 research examples of some of these interventions, and seeing I'm doing on time here, I think I'm doing okay. So we'll keep going for a little while. So the first comes from the Tübingen group. I mentioned Hannah a few minutes ago, along with many of the colleagues there. They've been doing something called the MoMA project on motivation and mathematics, in which they are working with German 9th grade students, showing them a video or showing them quotes about the relevance of motivation, of mathematics to them, and then seeing how it impacts their valuing of math immediately after the intervention, and then at 6-month follow-up. So as you can see, it's a really strong design, 2,000 students in a randomized control design. The Germans are nothing if they are not good methodologists, and this is a great example of a really strong methodological study. And so, as I said here, the data I will just mention is really some strong effects on valuing. And in a symposium on Saturday, Hannah will talk some about the achievement results. I won't steal her thunder here by telling you about them today, but having effects there as well. The second set of studies that I'll mention is the work that Judy Harakevich, Chris Hulliman, and her colleagues have been doing over the last several years. Really interesting work on trying to increase the relevance and utility value of mathematics for students at all different levels. And what they've done in their work is to look at kids in high school and at college levels, as well as sometimes parents, particularly of girls who are maybe struggling a little bit with math and science and not sure whether they continue, by trying to enhance the sense of relevance of that by having the kids and others write essays about the relevance, are showing that it's having some strong impact on their overall valuing of the mathematics that they're taking. And I think one thing it is important to point out, and actually Deborah and Judy, I'll take us back to Seoul, Korea. When we were in Seoul in 2009, there was a bunch of computers in the wonderful hotel we were staying at, and one day Judy got on her computer and said, "Our paper got accepted in science." So we were able to share the moment of that paper getting accepted, because maybe you all don't know this, having an educational social psychologist get a paper accepted in science is not an everyday event. So it's pretty fantastic that this work is showing up in science, and it shows its quality, at least in the metric of that quality of that journal. Judy will be talking more about this work on Saturday, so again, I don't want to steal her thunder or let her tell more about it. But in one of the most recent studies published in JPSB in 2015, they've been able to show that for underrepresented minority kids and first-generation kids in biology classes at the University of Wisconsin, that the utility value intervention is not only increasing their values, but also increasing their likelihood to stick with the biology courses after the initial course, which is a pretty important set of findings, I think, because that's a huge issue nationally in the US and probably in many other places as well. So, and you can hear more about that from Judy. She'll talk more about it on Saturday. Finally, Emily Rosenzweig, Chris Holloman, and my name is in there someplace, are doing a study in a Florida virtual high school in which we're trying to figure out if we can have an impact on kids taking an online class. This, by the way, is a really interesting study for me because there's been some wonderful sessions here in the last couple days about context and the importance of understanding context. We have no idea who these kids are or what they're doing or how they're understanding math, and we're trying to see if we can give them a utility value intervention online and make a difference in how much they value math. So it's a kind of a fascinating thing, and given everything we all know about online communication, at the beginning of the project we sent out some possible quotes to use for the kids and asked for kids to give reactions to them, and of course they were responding anonymously. If I were to put some of the quotes that we got back from some of the kids, we would all be blushing very red. So it's interesting how people can communicate when they don't know. But having said that, it's been really interesting to work on that. And so we did three kinds of things, had them write about utility value, analyze quotes, and maybe rank how good they were to see if in this fairly anonymous online class that all kids in Florida have to take, you just pause for a moment to think, is that a good idea? Should everybody have to take an online math course in 9th grade? Not sure, but that's the way the world is going, perhaps. So what the results are for that study are, come back on Saturday morning. I'm not going to tell you about that. Emily can tell you about that tomorrow. Again, I don't want to steal her thunder. But those are just three examples of some relatively brief interventions that are having strong effects, not just on kids' valuing of math, but also their performance in mathematics, and even the choices of continuing to stay on in mathematics. And so it's pretty exciting to see that work happening in those ways. There's been two recent reviews of the literature of this work that are out there. Chris Holloman and Rory Lazowski, one of his students, has something in RER last year doing a meta-analysis of a variety of the motivation interventions. And just several, I think, important points to mention about this. They looked at all sorts of different studies and selected down, but you can see that these studies are based on all sorts of different sorts of theoretical frameworks that have been in the motivation literature for a number of years. And one of the points that they made was it's really critical for intervention studies not only to be based in theory, but also be set up to test the theory in a way so that the results can inform some of the predictions coming out of theory. You can see some of the ways in which they measured motivation, or the studies measured motivation, achievement, and behavioral sorts of things, like whether kids were kicked out of school or were suspended, et cetera, et cetera. And it's important to note that the review that they did was not lab-based studies. It was only studies done in more naturalistic, real classroom kinds of settings. They were careful to say that. So because it was a meta-analysis, they reported effect sizes, and what they found was that overall, across all of the studies, the average effect size was almost 0.5. back to the symposium yesterday, those of you that are talking about whether relations of motivation to achievement are meaningful. If motivational interventions can impact kids' achievement and motivation at the effect size of 0.5, to me that seems pretty meaningful. And again, these are primarily relatively brief interventions that they're reviewing here. There's a number of moderators that's important to think about. I'll come back to the grade one in a moment. What they found was that most of the effects were stronger in middle school than in younger and in the high school kids. I was a little bit surprised about that for a reason or two I'll say in a minute, but it was actually really good to see that things were working in middle school, since middle school is a difficult time period. So that's one of the reviews, and you can see some of the conclusions there. And I think probably the middle bullet is the most important one. The brief, relatively inexpensive, and I'll come back to that point in a bit too. Relatively inexpensive interventions can have strong effects on kids' motivation-related beliefs and values, as well as other outcomes. And what Chris and Rory said in the paper is that they looked at some of the effect sizes of large school reform studies, and those effect sizes average about 0.1 as compared to the 0.5 that they're getting here. And so maybe we can make more of a difference doing relatively brief things in some of the larger interventions. One of our challenges, of course, in the field, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, is that many of us are not really trained to work directly with policymakers and others, and so we get these nice findings, but then we don't know how to get them out there. So I would advise talking to someone like Deborah about that, because she's had a lot of experience in the policy world, both at the National Research Council and other places. But we need to get better at communicating to people how strong these findings are in order to maybe impact motivation positively in different sorts of ways. So the second recent review is by Emily and me in 2016, educational psychologists. We focused here just on STEM interventions, not on interventions overall. And again, wanting to try to see if motivation interventions around STEM can deal with some of the issues about lack of representation of different groups in STEM fields overall. Sorry that I have the order of authorship wrong there, but Wang and Eccles in 2013 have a really interesting paper showing that high-achieving girls' choices of whether or not to keep in math classes and ultimately in majors in college is not based very much at all on how smart they think they are in math, but much more on whether they think it's interesting to them. And so the focus is turning away from competence and efficacy, at least for kids that have a pretty strong capability set already, and trying to think about how we can potentially get it more interesting for them. And in our review, we also tried to focus on theory-driven studies from a variety of theoretical backgrounds there that are probably pretty well known to most of us. There's a lot of strong effects we found in these studies, a range like Chris and Rory found, so the effect size varied, but overall we found reasonably strong effects in many of these studies, particularly the ones that were clearly theoretically driven. And I'll come back to that point in a minute, and I think that's a really critical point here. Gender was a moderator in some of the studies, sometimes going in favor of females, sometimes in favor of males, so it's interesting to see how these effects are moderated. And sometimes also the initial level of whether the motivation was relatively high or low. And we're beginning to, people haven't really looked at this too much yet, but people are beginning to think about some of the contextual moderators for the kinds of interventions that are going on here. So one of the things that we tried to drive home in this paper is the importance of trying to align the theory behind the intervention that you're doing, and then how it gets measured. We were pretty shocked, and Emily did most of the initial review of the studies. Somebody would say, well, we're going to do an intervention on self-efficacy, and they would nicely cite Bandera, and then they'd have a measure of something totally unrelated to self-efficacy as their outcome measure. It's like, well, why are you doing that if you're trying to do an efficacy intervention? Or sometimes people would have measures from a given theory, but not really specify the theory from which the measure came, and so it was really difficult to understand why they measured what they did. Those of you that have worked recently with IES know that they are requiring people to have a theory of change specified in any study that you're doing, particularly around interventions. And so again, looking at the literature, the published literature, often in reasonably good journals, we were just pretty shocked at how often there wasn't a good theory, or the theory didn't match up with either what was done in the intervention or with the outcome measures. And so the whole point of trying to align those, I think, is really critical as we move forward in the literature. And probably the last, kind of going back to 2011, maybe I think Yeager and Walton are right that the social psychological interventions clearly aren't magic because there's lots going on there. But we're finding that the pattern of findings are more complex. They're moderated by things, and there are some interactions. And so the story is getting, even with simple interventions, the story is more complicated, as probably most of you expect in the world. We can't do everything magical with simple things, but there's a lot of strong effects going on. I've lost the arrow. I do need my glasses. There they are. Okay, so I think I'm getting there. So let me just conclude with a few directions for the intervention research as we move forward over the next few years. I'm trained in both developmental and educational psychology, as is Deborah, and so I think it's really important for those of us doing interventions to think about how they might be working developmentally. So what happens when you do something in elementary versus middle versus high school, and should we be focusing on some of the same things there? As I said in Rory and Chris's paper, they found that the effect sizes for the motivation interventions that they reviewed were stronger at middle school. Going back to the stability data I reported earlier, you would think that by the time kids get to middle school, given that their beliefs and values are more stable, that maybe it would take more work to change them around. You can't just give kids a few messages about values or on how capable they are if they've had a history of not doing very well. It's going to take some pretty sustained effort to do that, yet the effect sizes were stronger at middle schools. Like in cognitive psychology, there's always the emphasis on early interventions, kind of try to fix things before they get too set. I think the same thing potentially to apply to motivation work, though we're not currently seeing that, at least in Chris and Rory's review. But more importantly, I think we do need to think really carefully about what kind of things do we do with elementary school kids that are different than middle school kids, that are different than high school kids, when we're thinking about enhancing their expectancies and values. And so the people will continue to think about that moving forward. I think another really critical question is how complex do these interventions have to be and how long do they need to last? So just going back to Corey for a minute, our designs have ranged from 6 to 12 weeks with many motivation principles, lots of instructional time for teachers, pretty hard work and many resources involved. Many of the social psychological interventions are much briefer than that, 90 minutes, 45 minutes, a couple times, and having some strong effects. But one thing we noticed, Emily and I noticed in the literature, is that people have really not systematically studied how long intervention needs to be effective, or how short does it need to be? How quickly can we get things accomplished? Similarly, people haven't really looked at the dosage sort of issue. How intense of a dose of these things do we need versus how moderate of a dose? And often those two things are confounded. You'll have long-term interventions with light doses, long-term with intense doses, and so it's kind of hard to parse those out. And I think moving forward, trying to get a better handle on that will really help us understand how these interventions are working. The other thing about the sort of timing and the size of the interventions is the cost. In Corey, there's a lot of teacher time and training time and other sorts of times, fiscal resources involved. To the extent that briefer interventions work, I think that's great in terms of resource and other kinds of issues that are always a big problem in schools. What other variables from expectancy value might we intervene on? People are suddenly beginning to look at cost as one of those. Emily's dissertation will be about that. Tony Perez at Old Dominion is doing a cost intervention, trying to get students to understand how biology and physics maybe don't have to be as costly as they think. And Shirley Yu was doing some work at OSU on this. So it's nice to see the value interventions moving not just utility value, but also trying to do some cost decreases. And then scaling up and fidelity are just huge issues in all of this literature. How do we take interventions to scale? I haven't seen it yet, but I understand there's a short mindsets video that's being distributed nationally now. So again, kind of going back to the contextual points yesterday, is it going to be enough for kids to watch a short video about growth and incremental and entity mindsets, and it's going to have a big effect on any kids, regardless of context, regardless of age, regardless of this, that, and the other? It's having some effects, so maybe it does. But there's different approaches to doing that, and I think we need to look at that carefully. With more complex interventions, scaling up is always a really challenging thing. And in Corey, we give teachers a lot of autonomy, so how do you scale up and also try to maintain that as well? So I think those are important issues moving forward here. So where are we now? Just sort of finish up here to take it to our limits one more time. Let's sort of think about what I've tried to walk us through today. So the initial story, and one that we talked about for many years, is the kids' motivation declines over the course of the school years, as do their motivational beliefs and values. Our current story, and one I think will continue to get elaborated, is that these changes are more complex than we thought. Still a lot of patterns of decline, but not for everybody, and there's still many groups we haven't looked at, and so I think it's important to continue to do that. I'm very encouraged by the work on the motivation interventions of different sizes and shapes and sorts, having impacts not just on the motivational variables, but also performance and choice. And as we move forward, trying to develop maximally effective interventions that for the least cost that can impact the most kids is really important work. And I hope some of you will be taking that on as the rest of us fade off into the distance here. So, Evcharisto, thank you very much.
We have time for questions.
Stunned silence. Yeah. Yes, Tim.
Thanks for that presentation, Allan. That was fantastic. The recent work on micro-interventions has been a little too recent maybe to look at some of the longer-term consequences. And I'm wondering if you've seen the paper that has just come out online, I think in Journal of Ed Psych, about the values affirmation things not really holding up, not a lot of evidence. I'm wondering if you've seen that, and if so, what you think the implications are for other micro-interventions.
Yeah, great question. I haven't seen that paper yet, but I think obviously that could have been another good issue for future research. How long are these effects lasting? And are simpler interventions lasting less than more complex interventions? I heard a really great talk by Ken Dodge on interventions at a conference in Laguna Beach last year. He's done a lot of work on social competence interventions. And one of the things he said, and I think it's really important to think about as we think about the long-term effects of interventions, is not just the interventions themselves, but what happens to the kids after they leave the intervention. And what he was talking about is if kids get to understand better things to make them interact more positively socially and has really strong effects at first, if they go back into a pretty difficult classroom environment, those effects are going to wash out because they're no longer getting any of that sort of same stimulation as they had before. And the same thing could be happening with the motivation or the values affirmation interventions as well. So if you go back into a pretty terrible classroom after you're getting your motivation boosted, particularly maybe the next year, why should an intervention continue to happen? So I really do think we need to study the long-term consequences of the interventions, but also we need to really look at what kinds of classrooms are going to continue to promote the effects and which might actually undermine them in the future. So it's not just simply the intervention itself, but where kids go after that that's going to make a big difference there. But thanks, I'll take a look at the paper. It sounds really interesting. I think Judy's going to say a few words on values affirmations on Saturday. So I keep advertising subsequent sessions here. So, other questions? Oh, sorry, yes.
Well, thank you, Allan, for the great talk. It was wonderful. I was just wondering, just going on with what Tim said, have you ever measured whether after intervention, whether teachers keep applying what they have been taught for the training? I mean, I would be interested to know whether a teacher includes the training methods in his everyday, let's say, teaching practices after the training. I mean, a sort of change in his teaching practices in the future. I mean, not whether the intervention is effective not only for the students, but for the teachers as well.
Yeah, good point. So I can tie that back to what Deborah said yesterday, the sort of the conversation about intervention light. So if teachers get a few ideas, but don't really learn how to implement them systematically, maybe that actually will do more harm than good. Unfortunately, we didn't study this systematically in Corey, but what we found in talking to a lot of the teachers after we had left the schools, that they really felt their teaching practices have been changed in fundamental ways, and they kept doing that after we left, so it didn't require the researchers to be there. They really felt like it was making a difference for their kids, and so they wanted to keep doing it. I wish I could say I had a study that shows that that lasted and had really good effects on their kids the next year, so all I can do is those anecdotal reports. Yeah, but clearly if teachers go through some kind of training, and particularly if they haven't really bought into it, maybe implement it for a while, it's probably going to fade away. And so again, kind of back to Tim's question, it's not really just what's happening with the students, but also what's happening with the teachers in the classrooms as well. And so I think maintenance and boosts and coming back to talk to the teachers about how things are going would be another really important way to try to keep the intervention effects going.
Can I add to that?
Sure, please.
Sorry, I mean to, but we have found that what is really important is that the administration of the school is signed on to the intervention, and because it's the larger context that the teacher's living in that seems to make a big difference in whether they can follow through. So we always have learned that if you don't involve the principal and the administration, we know it's going to disappear as soon as we go away.
And I'll build it up. So one anecdote from Corey, we had worked really closely with one school district, and they were really in favor of that. We had worked with a sort of associate superintendent. He decided to take another job, so a new associate superintendent came in, and we were taking Corey to the middle school level, and had hoped to continue working with the district because they've been really, really happy with it. But the new associate superintendent had to make her own mark, and so she said, well, that's all well and good and kind of nice, but I have other ideas, and we were out. And so those kinds of collaborations and what the mission of the school and the particular people in administrative positions and the principals is really central to that as well. So it's really complicated because those positions change over kind of quickly, and you develop relationships and things disappear, but I digress. It's a challenging thing to do, but important to try.
That will target to the students.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear it all the way through.
Yes, usually interventions target to the teachers in order to provoke changes to the students. My question is, have you ever thought of an intervention that will target to the students in order to provoke changes to students and to teachers as well?
I'm not sure I'm totally following it. So I guess I think our Corey stuff it's targeted at teacher practices, but clearly looking to try to get the kids more involved with things that boost their motivation. So we haven't looked directly at, say, something like encouraging kids to build their efficacy individually, but by the activities and the feedback on all of that. So I'm struggling with my answer to your question. Maybe we can talk about it after the session a little bit. So I'm sure I understand. Go ahead, why don't you answer the question? You're doing a better job.
No, I mean, there are a lot of interventions that target the student specifically. So Carol Dweck's mindset interventions go directly to the student. Jeff Cohen's social psychology interventions go target directly the students. But I don't think they have in mind ultimately changing teacher behavior. I think they assume that if you can change the way students look at the world and think about the world and interpret the world, that's all that's necessary. So there's not an expectation that teachers will somehow change the way they behave, although it's a very interesting idea. Because if the students begin to behave differently, perhaps the teacher would behave differently as well.
So why don't we give a little transition to the next session? We have always been running just a little bit late, so I'm going to take on the chair role here and say disperse, get to your next session so they can start on time, and that way I don't have to answer anything. Thank you.